Alright, this weekend in the world of combat sports, we have another mega fight. The one and only Nate Diaz is going to return after last fighting Tony Ferguson and beating him. He had 4th round submission, left the UFC, and said, hey, I'm going to do my own thing. Wanted to do a little bit of boxing. We all knew what that meant. That meant to face the one and only Jake Paul, the guy that's been knocking out all the MMA fighters. Anderson Silva, Tyron Woodley, Ben Askren. The list goes on, and man, he's trying to add Nate Diaz to the list. And obviously, this is a boxing match. Typically, we're very skeptical of MMA fighters heading into boxing. I mean, it started with Conor McGregor, who actually had a pretty decent showing against Floyd Mayweather, and then eventually it led to, a lot of influencers challenging MMA fighters. Now it's kind of become this thing, MMA versus boxing, and this is another one of those examples because Nate Diaz honestly has all the odds stacked against him, right? And he's a pretty massive underdog. Looking at the odds, I believe he's like a plus 300 underdog, and he's going to be fighting, like I said, Jake Paul, and we all know Jake Paul. I mean, he started off in the scene boxing YouTubers, then boxing NBA players, moved on to MMA fighters, and is now trying to challenge pro boxers like Tommy Fury, although he did lose that bout earlier this year. So this is kind of Jake's comeback fight, right? This is him with a new team with Shane Mosley back in his corner, and a bounce back win that's supposed to show a new style that makes us say, hey, maybe Jake could beat Tommy Fury in a potential rematch. Even though I think that is not going to happen, I don't think that Jake will ever beat Tommy Fury unless Tommy Fury just vacations for the next 30 years and Jake spends the next 30 years training. Like, Tommy just has too much experience. Jake's style is too predictable, and Tommy's seen it before. I mean, he's sparred people like Jake since he was 8 years old. You're not going to beat Tommy Fury with the style Jake has, with just the jab, right hand, simple boxer style. I mean, it's very typical, so I'm curious to see what he does in this fight to make us say, hey, maybe he beats him in a Tommy Fury rematch, because if you're Jake Paul, I mean, that's what Jake Paul wants. He wants that Tommy Fury rematch. So what I'm trying to say is I think we're going to see a Jake Paul that maybe seems different, but I think pairing up with Shane Mosley just tells me that he really doesn't understand why he lost to Tommy Fury. To me, I think he thinks that he just made a few boxing errors here and there, but the thing Jake doesn't understand is he'll never beat Tommy Fury in a boxing match, right? And that's why I said KSI has a better chance at beating Tommy Fury, because he has a more awkward style with a lot of power, while Jake is more of a typical boxer with typical power. His knockout over Tyron Woodley is very impressive, but if he had such crazy power, I still think he should have been able to knock out Anderson, especially with the shots that he was landing on Anderson. It makes his power seem a little suspect to me, and also the fact, you saw Ben Askren not even get knocked out, but to be fair, he did take a lot of shots from Robbie Lawler, so you could say that Ben Askren just has a good chin. But look, either way, the matchup is intriguing. This is 10 rounds. I talked about it previously. Will that make a difference? I don't think so. Look, Jake is a smart fighter in the way that I guess he's more of a smart businessman, because he picks his matchups very wisely. He doesn't try to take too many chances. He knows what boxing and MMA guy does for him, especially with the name of Nate Diaz. I mean, that's just going to boost him and boost his credibility up a lot, even though this is an older MMA fighter. And I think the big question mark around this fight, which I don't think is so big of a question mark, can Nate, kind of tough out those early rounds and have Jake punch himself out and have Jake get gassed in the later rounds where Nate Diaz will take over and maybe get a late finish or a decision? That kind of seems to be the argument leaning towards Nate, but right away, guys, I'm going to say I don't think there's any way Nate Diaz is going to win this fight. It's unfortunate because I am a big Nate Diaz fan, and man, I've been watching a lot of his older fights recently, trying to watch for this Jake Paul fight, and it just, man, him in his younger days, man, there was nothing else like it. It's just, he was a lot faster, a lot better with the boxing. You could just tell, he's wearing his age, especially even in that Tony Ferguson fight. Now it's been almost a year later, so I don't really expect Nate Diaz to come out very good, and I think there's a lot on the line for Nate Diaz, right, with this fight, because if he loses this fight, right, Nate Diaz has made it apparent and said, hey, I want to go back to the UFC. Can he go back to the UFC if he gets knocked out by Jake Paul? And let's just say it is early. I don't think Dana White is going to want to sign him back with that kind of stain on his legacy, because that is something that a lot of people aren't going to get over. Even though Nate Diaz is a big star, I guess you got to kind of wonder, is Nate Diaz's stardom bigger than him winning or losing a fight against Jake Paul? But let me talk about the actual fight and what I think each fighter needs to do. Although my prediction is Jake Paul, I will talk and say, hey, Nate Diaz does bring a very awkward style, and I think that Jake Paul might have some problems in there than I think most of us might be expecting. And I mean, Nate Diaz, keep in mind, it was only 2 years ago where he rocked Leon Edwards with that big left hand and had him stumbling around the cage, right? And he's the current UFC welterweight champion. So if he could do that to Leon Edwards, can he do it to Jake Paul? And Nate Diaz has been keeping a lot of his boxing training a secret. He didn't really show anything at the open workouts, hasn't really been advertising this fight so much. While we've seen Jake box, right? We've seen him box a couple times, and for the most part, we've seen Nate Diaz box. That's mostly his style in the UFC. It's rare, he ever goes for takedowns. Yes, he has a phenomenal jiu-jitsu game, but usually it's because someone else kind of enters that realm that he uses it. But for the most part, mostly just him boxing. And boxing in MMA and boxing in just boxing are very different, as you guys know. I mean, look at the MMA fighters that have lost, and Jake Paul is a young kid, period, right? And I've talked about this recently where I forgot what fight we're talking about, but someone that's been learning boxing for as long as Jake has, which is like 6 years, right? You're going to learn more in a 6-month period, which was when the last Tommy Fury fight was, than someone like Nate Diaz will in this time, because he has trained boxing for a long time, trained MMA for a long time. He isn't going to learn as many things. He already knows those tricks. And I just think the question here is, man, is Nate Diaz too old for this matchup? Because that's another thing, you know, we see Tony Ferguson last week and be very slow with the punches, reacting to them with Bobby Green. It was a tough sight. Will we see something similar with Nate Diaz? And honestly, guys, I think this is what we're going to see. I think we're going to see Jake Paul really land a lot of shots, a lot of jabs, a lot of right hands, and really make Nate Diaz uncomfortable. Do I think Jake Paul is going to finish Nate Diaz? Now, this is a tough question for me. I could imagine a scenario where there's a standing 8 count. Maybe he does knock down Nate Diaz. Maybe he even knocks him out cold. I mean, that's a possibility. Nate Diaz has taken a lot of damage throughout his career, right? I mean, you look at a lot of the bouts, even the fight with Tony Ferguson, he took a decent amount of damage. Wasn't so crazy damage, but still. Masvidal took a whole lot of damage. Against Leon, he took a lot of damage. So the guy is there to be hit. And it's just a matter of how powerful is Jake Paul. And I honestly don't think he's so powerful. I know a lot of people kind of gas his power, say he does hit very hard. I think he probably hits average. Maybe he hits a little bit better than average, right? But I think this is no power that Nate Diaz hasn't felt before. I mean, in all honesty, he's been hit with 4-ounce gloves. And like I said, he isn't the type to go for takedowns, right? Where you can make an argument with Khabib and be like, well, he hasn't been knocked out. But arguably the reason why Khabib hasn't been knocked out is because he's able to interrupt times where he's stunned with the grappling. Not that he's ever been stunned that much, but you guys get what I'm trying to say, right? Like with other MMA fighters, you might be able to make the argument and say, hey, well, he had a good chin because he was able to incorporate grappling, right? Where Nate Diaz doesn't usually go for takedowns or clinch that much when he's hurt. He just kind of eats the shots. And yes, eventually I think everybody does have a ticking time clock where they're going to expire, right? Where those shots are going to just eventually just knock you out. We've seen it with Tony Ferguson, although he showed a lot of toughness in the last fight. But what I'm trying to say is everybody gets old. Everybody can no longer fight as well as they used to. And I think Nate Diaz is probably way past that point, if we're going to be honest. And I mean, the guy's taken so much damage. It's not like he's, you know, a very active fighter either in the UFC. So, and this is a new sport for him. And Jake Paul's been pretty active. I mean, he already fought this year. In the past year, he's fought 3 times. Jake Paul works a lot. So he has the advantage in terms of activity, probably power, because we know Nate Diaz doesn't throw a lot of power into his shots. It's more just volume type stuff. I think he's going to need to really pressure Jake. If he wants to win, he's going to need Jake going backwards. He needs to go forward. He can't do what he was doing with Tony Ferguson and do, you know, play games here and there. Jake Paul really wants to make a statement with this win, because if he knocks out Nate Diaz, although a lot of boxing people aren't going to give him credit for being a good boxer, which they shouldn't, it's going to open the conversation for, hey, Conor McGregor couldn't knock out Nate Diaz. Can we make a Conor McGregor versus Jake Paul fight? Though I don't think that is going to happen. There's going to be arguments, and a lot of people are going to say, wow, he was able to knock out Nate Diaz, but this person wasn't, this person. It doesn't really matter, because like I said, everybody has a ticking time clock. At the end of the day, I think if he does knock him out, it's just the accumulation of damage. It really is going to depend on the shot, I guess. We'll see, but I think a prime Nate Diaz does a lot better in this matchup. Not saying that I think he would win anyway, but I think we're going to see Jake Paul land a lot of shots. Nate Diaz not really commit too much. Maybe he throws a few flurries here and there, but I think for the most part, we're going to see Jake really dominant with the jab, dominant with the right hand, and I think we're going to see him control the fight. It is a little bit interesting that this is a southpaw. Anderson Silva was southpaw, and Jake Paul did pretty well against him and knocked him down. Jake Paul's also knocked down every single opponent he has fought in his pro career, so will Nate Diaz get added to that list? I don't know, man. I could see him getting knocked down, knocked out. I don't know, though. I don't think he's going to get knocked out. I think it'll go to a decision, a pretty dominant decision for Jake Paul. I think he's just going to outland Nate Diaz, land the bigger shots, and maybe Nate Diaz is going to have success here and there. I could see him maybe giving Jake problems here and there in certain exchanges because he's so awkward and because he's so hard to fight, right? And he's such a veteran of the sport. And the guy has been training with real boxers. So Nate Diaz is definitely one of the better boxers to go into boxing just because of his background, right? I'm not going to say he's the best, but he's probably better off than maybe Tyron Woodley was, and especially Ben Askren. I'm not going to say Anderson Silva. Maybe Anderson probably had an advantage over Nate Diaz, but man, that would be a fun fight. Nate Diaz versus Anderson Silva. That's what they really should have made. But guys, I'm getting too ahead of myself. I'm excited for it, although I know it's not the most competitive of matchups. I think it's going to be a decent fight, and I'm pretty excited for Saturday night. Guys, let me know in the comment section below, who do you guys think is going to win, Nate Diaz or Jake Paul? The open workouts were available. I'm going to try to react to the face-to-face if they ever release it. I know Nate Diaz walked out, but let me know if you guys want to see that. Thank you guys for watching. You guys are the best fan base in MMA, and I'll see you guys in the next one.